Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and possibly good evening to the people in Asian Pacific. My name is Xiankun Lu. I'm the CEO of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG Geneva. For those who probably are not yet familiar with our organization, we are a humble think tank, independent and based in Geneva, of course, with people from all over the world, like including Jonathan from Canada and Sherry from US and others from Asia, Africa, and almost everywhere. We were expanding. Today we have a very heavy subject. I say heavy because of its importance, not because of other aspects. Is on trade and environment, which always features highly on both the work of the WTO, but also on the work of our group. We have done a few sessions in the past, and we take this opportunity to invite our distinguished panel, simply because recently you all know that we have had some very high-level events all around the world on this with the COP28, some interesting results, such as calling on the countries to transition away from fossil fuel and other important aspects. And Hoe Lim has been there with DG for this, I think it's first time, the trade day on the COP meetings. And DG has really highly promoted the role of trade and how trade and WTO can contribute to the to sustainability. I think one thing she said very kind of vocally, which I quote, "We cannot get a net zero without trade because it is indispensable for spreading low carbon to everywhere it is needed," end of quote. I won't take time to introduce our panelists because they are no strangers to this community. And I will probably give more time to them to present their views, and then we can go to the questions and answers. So we have quite some interesting questions to tackle. I will start with Hoe Lim, who is director of the WTO on this subject. Hoe Lim, probably would you kindly start by introducing how you, ODG, are looking at the results of the COP28, of course, not only COP28, but also previous meetings, and what that do they mean for the WTO, and can we build upon them, and how can the WTO members kind of build upon them to make sure that we have a trade element in any future solutions. In particular, what do we expect from MC13? And then after I will start, we'll get to Ignacio and followed by Pradeep. If that's okay for you, and Hoe Lim, the floor is yours, please. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lou, and great to see friends and former acquaintances again on this panel. I mean, at the outset, Lou, I have to say that I'm probably going to disappoint. I'm not going to be able to really manage to answer all of the questions that you've put forward, which are really quite critical questions, but I'll do my best to try to join this conversation on these critical points. You asked about, how do we look at the results from COP28, or at least how does the Secretariat, from its participation at the COP, look at the results? I think we probably be useful to just recap very, very briefly a little bit as to what do we mean by results from COP28. Some of you may follow this very deeply. Some of those may not follow it so closely. At the outset, I think I can say that, after following it for a few years, it's such a complex process. I mean, put it very mildly, it's not one single thing. It's a multitude of different tracks that are all happening at the same time at COP28. You have, of course, the really official negotiations of the climate change community, the governments, of course, negotiating COP28 formally. But at the same time, you also have the COP28 presidency, which is the UAE for COP28, which also has its own program and agenda, of course, in support of the climate change conference, but it's another track, okay? And then in addition to whatever the COP28 presidency is putting forward, you have the whole, I would say, global community, put it at large, that will consist of businesses, private sector, think tanks like yourself, civil society, associations, individual companies, also gathering at the same time. And they are also putting forward their pathways, pledges, and so forth. So it's a multitude of things happening at the same time. But perhaps the most critical one to start with is the actual COP28. What was COP28 about, and what was actually on the agenda? It was the first so-called global stocktake. The Paris Agreement sets forward a 5-yearly review of implementation. And this was the so-called first global stocktake. Not telling you anything that you don't really know. Going into COP28 and at COP28, it was clearly the case that the parties were not on track to meet the goals as set out in the Paris Agreement. So the global stocktake was going to be a situation where we needed to have more ambition. So the expectations are going to be, what can the nearly 200 parties to the COP28 agree to do coming out of COP28? How can they so-called step up ambition? And at the same time, you have very important issues which have been with the COPs for quite some time, which are, for instance, issues of climate finance, the 100 billion that is the agreed amount to support developing countries annually, plus the loss and damage fund that was agreed upon at COP27, implementing that part of the COP results. And you have the whole range of, as I said, of private sector, individual governments, plus civil society and so forth, pledges as to how they would again raise ambition, support, deal with issues of mitigation and adaptation. So it's in that mix, I think, that you have to see the sort of trade connections. And I think again, not saying anything that you would not have heard, that with each COP, I think you see more and more it's not as though it's new. I think it's always been there, but you see more and more the need to think about the trade component or the trade dimension to both how do we actually achieve the ambition that is behind the COPs and the climate change goals, but at the same time, how do we do so in a way that is fair, equitable, meets the challenges of just transition, the challenges that many countries face already with adaptation, and how does one practically go forward? And many of these issues you already mentioned, some such as transition away from fossil fuels, is a big ticket item. It clearly has a linkage to trade, to the WTO, for instance, and also to many other organizations. And maybe I don't want to take too much more time, just to say that the contribution from the Secretariat as led by the DG was ready to bring to the forefront a bit more some of these issues, put a little bit more of a, I would say, sort of knowledge-based products to the discussion. And the trade day that you mentioned about at COP28 is really a trade day by the UAE presidency. So presidencies to COPs designate different days, and there's been a tradition over the years that they have different types of days. This is the first time that they have integrated or provided a trade day focus to the COP28. And that trade day was, again, I think was a really important day for us. It was really not just our day, though. I think I have to stress that this was a day that was put out for all of the organizations who have an interest and who work on trade. And that includes, of course, in our case, a partnership between WTO, International Chamber of Commerce, the International Trade Center, and UNCTAD. But the Trade Day agenda itself proper is from the COP28 presidency, but then other organizations chip in and provide their own sort of inputs to such a day. A bit on issues. I mean, what are the issues that that came out, from these discussions? They're quite wide-ranging. I'll be also, of course, interested to hear from the other panel, and I think what number of them were also there at COP28. But for instance, one thing that came out from COP28 was that a way to step up ambition is to really bring out much more in terms of what we can do to support renewable energy generation, for instance. There was a pledge towards tripling renewable energy use by a certain date, which I've forgotten. And that gives a very clear link to the role of supply chains for renewable energy, which is, at the end of the day, breaks down again to goods and services. There's the agenda on decarbonization, both of the economy more generally, as well as the logistics of trade, let's put it that way, transportation and so forth. You have a very clear agenda on that, which has a relationship to trade. You have discussions on very specific sectors. Steel, for instance, is a sector that is a heavy emitting sector. There was the so-called steel standards principles that standards bodies and IOs, including the WTO Secretariat, was helping to put together, putting forward how TBT principles in general can be helpful to this work of steel standards. There are discussions on deforestation, which has a link again to trade. Carbon pricing, the use of border carbon adjustments to a certain extent was also something that was in the mix. And you have a lot of issues on development and just transition. So I'm giving you a very sketchy overview of lots of things. And then your last part of your question, what can be expected at MC13? I really cannot tell you much more than the fact that there is a deliberative session in the program for ministers, not to deliberate on climate change, but on trade and environment across the whole spectrum. And if you refer back to the MC12 paragraph on trade and environment, it's a recognition of the triple planetary crisis, which is both climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss. So that's the expectation as far as I can tell you at the moment. And then in addition to that, you have the environmental initiatives. This is not the multilateral process, so to speak, but it's the trade and environmental structure discussions, the dialogue on plastics pollution, and the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. And so they have their own contributions that they will be making, and they're still in the process of discussing it, albeit at a very advanced stage, and that will be either declarations from them or co-conveners reports from them to the ministers. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to come back again later on. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Hoe Lim. That's a really good kickstart of the discussion. Of course, I mean, on the issue, on what you mentioned about MC13, I think is music to the ears for many of us around here, that the minister are going to do a specific deliberation on trade and environment. We hope that we could get some concrete results or fruits of this kind of deliberation on how WTO in the future could make sure that trade contributes to green transition. And of course, we also have some interesting plurilateral, if I could say so, initiatives going on, and probably they could also bring some interesting results to this meeting. So I think that will give as a nice opportunity to listen to Ignacio, because Ignacio is the representative of the EU on this subject and has been very vocal on this issue. And EU itself has been a leading party in driving the WTO work, both multilateral and multilateral, on the trade and environment initiatives. So, Ignacio, what do you think about the incoming MC13? Of course, considering what has happened at COP28, we can expect from the ministers both multilaterally and plurilaterally. Thank you, Ignacio.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Xiankun Lu, and first of all, thanks a lot for having me here again. I think if I remember correctly, the last time I participated in one of your discussions was about CBAM. So this is, again, another opportunity to talk about the trade and environment interface. And I think Hoe Lim has very well explained what is the current state of play. Let me give you a little bit of what I think is the European Union expectation about what could happen in NC13. And let me start by saying that we will very much subscribe what Didi De Rossi has said. You cannot achieve net zero without trade. As many of us are moving towards implementing our commitments to net zero, inevitably there are going to be measures that will be taken that will have an impact on trade. And that is why it's so important to have a strong deliberation within the WTO on the trade and environment interface. I think the key question, and it's not a simple question, is what it is that the WTO can do positively to contribute towards the decarbonization objectives and other global environmental challenges. And it's a hard question, which I think is why it's a very, very good idea to have a political discussion in NC13, where ministers will be able to have this kind of conversation, because we need some political impulse, we need some political guidance to try to see how to advance on these conversations in the context of the WTO. So we very much welcome the initiative by Dr. Negossi to have a deliberative session. I think it's going to be about trade and sustainable development, including climate. I think that's the latest formulation I have heard. But anyway, it will be very important to have that conversation taking place at the political ministerial level. Now, what it is, apart from political discussion, that we could aim to achieve in NC13, and there I would like to talk about three areas. One is the mainstreaming of the issues relating to the environment into other work streams in the WTO. Secondly is about the role of the Committee on Trade and Environment. And finally, I will talk about plurilateral initiatives. And last but not least, I would like to say a few words about the European Union Green Deal measures. So when it comes to mainstreaming, I think that we should not forget that there are at least 2 or 3 discussions that are going to take place in MC13. We have a strong environmental dimension attached to them. There is a negotiation on fisheries subsidies, and being able to conclude a second phase fisheries subsidies agreement, which is solid from the point of view of sustainability, will be probably the best deliverable that the WTO could actually do in terms of contributing towards sustainability goals. So as we talk about the role of the Committee on Trade and Environment, we should not forget also the broader picture. There's also discussions on agriculture, which are going to be difficult, as there usually are discussions about agriculture. But it is very clear that it is one area where you could actually say you can contribute both to trade and to environmental goals is through further reductions in trade distorting domestic support. So conversations about trade distorting domestic support, PSH in the agricultural sector, also are things that are important if you actually want to look into the global picture about what it is that the WTO can do to contribute towards sustainability. And finally, as you know, there are some initiatives to open new areas of deliberation in the WTO, not only the trade and environment interface, but for instance, also the interface between trade and industrial policies. And it's clear that as you are talking today about industrial policies, a lot of these industrial policies are green industrial policies. So again, I think that if we decide to open up that deliberation in the WTO, that would be another area where this environmental consideration will have to be mainstream. And I think all of this, from our point of view, is very good, because you should not actually look into the environment as just the issue that you discussed in the Committee on Trade and Environment. I mean, we are strong believers on reinforcing the role of the Committee on Trade and Environment. This was one of the important achievements when the WTO was created, the decision to establish this horizontal Committee on Trade and Environment. And we really think that it has a lot of potential to do much more than what it is currently doing. We think it's very good that in the context of the Committee on Trade and Environment, we are moving much more towards thematic conversations. We need to see how to have more than conversations. I mean, how the Committee on Trade and Environment can also be a forum that potentially can deliver outcomes, not legally binding outcomes. I think we should move away from this idea that the WTO is only a place to disputes and to agree on rules. I think you need to be able to develop more outcomes that the WTO can produce. And from that point of view, reinforcing the role of the Committee on Trade and Environment is something that we are quite attached to, and we are very much working with the Secretariat, with Ambassador Valencia, which unfortunately is not able to join us today, to see how this role of the city can be further recognized. Then there's, of course, different plurilateral initiatives. I would not go into the details. I think Hoe Lim has mentioned TESTI, fossil fuel subsidies, plastic pollution. Let me just refer to one particular initiative on which the European Union has been very strongly invested, which is the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate. We had a meeting of the coalition in Davos. I was not there, but I mean, I have been told that it was actually a very good discussion. I know that Virginia Rossi was there, and she was also very positively impressed from the conversations. Particularly, it was just a real attempt to bring in different constituencies together. So you had not only trade ministers participating, you also had environmental ministers, you also have finance ministers, and it was a real first attempt to see how you could try to bridge the gaps between different perspectives. It's going to be critical if we really want to see how we can jointly advance towards the goal of decarbonization. So that's, as I said, expectations for 2013, fossil fuel subsidies, agriculture, reinforcing the role of the CTE, hopefully a good political conversation to give a sense about how we should be advancing in the WTO in the direction of contributing towards decarbonization. But of course, I would also like to say a few words about the European Union Green Deal measures, because we have been, of course, taking a little bit of a leading role in adopting certain measures for the protection of the environment to achieve our net zero objectives, which have some impacts on trade. And we have been very keen to fully engage on those measures in the WTO. Not purely from the transparency point of view. I think there has been an important component of transparency, explaining what we are doing, answering to questions from countries. And you may know that our Director General for Taxation, who is responsible for CBAM, was in Geneva just before Christmas to have a meeting with his ambassadors and to discuss in detail the CBAM. And our Director General for the Environment did the same early this year on the deforestation regulation. And these are not one-off events. It is something that for us should be part of a dialogue, because as we are moving towards the phase of implementation of those regulations, we are certainly very keen to see how this implementation can be done in a manner which is as trade-friendly as possible. So I think that from that point of view, having this regular interaction in the WTO about the implementation of our Green Deal measures, for us is something that we have been doing, that we will continue to do. As I said, it's probably even more critical now because we are moving much more to the implementation phase. And we really want to try to understand also what are concerns and how one can be responding to those concerns. So all in all, I think we have quite a lot of work ahead of us, and we sincerely hope that the political conversation that we actually have in NC 13 is something that really helps to achieve the ambition for the WTO to make a positive contribution towards decarbonization.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. A very kind of comprehensive presentation on the expectations on MC13, both multilateral and plurilateral, but also on some interesting development on the EU measures on the Green Deal. I mean, coming to the multilateral, I read that there have been some interesting proposals by like Ken's group on agriculture, domestic support, and how that we could look at it from a new triangle on the kind of climate change or sustainability perspective. Industrial policy is also interesting if we could see it from a green perspective. But those are hardcore issues. I think that it needs probably much more time to have dialogue among members and also with the other stakeholders like NGOs and private sector to see how we can push this forward. And on all these issues you have mentioned, of course, this kind of dialogue, developed countries, of course, is a key part of this discussion. I think that Pradeep recently has written a very interesting article on this. And I think that on the way forward, many things we are discussing all needs great participation and also contribution, of course, a fair and equitable manner by developing countries. And also we need also to look at how we could assist the more vulnerable ones on how we could bring them on board. So with that, I'll give floor to Pradeep, who can share with us on this aspect. Pradeep, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me greet everybody in Hindi. Namaskar. It doesn't matter which time of the day it is or wherever you are. It means I bow down to you. I surrender to you. Having said that, let me start with one basic premise which often confuses the discussions on trade and environment, that environment is not sustainable development. Sustainable development is much more than environment. It includes development, it includes equity. And these are the other two dimensions of sustainable development which seems to be missing from the debate, or at least the thinking. And therefore, we have this kind of unilateralism which the European Union has taken on hand to launch the CBAM and the forest rules, etc., etc. One often wonders is, why was it not possible to put it forward as a proposal, the way you all proposals are put, and have a bigger discussion on it rather than to say that, look, this is our decision, take it or leave it, fine. What is your response? Tell us that, and we'll see what best we can do. This is like putting a gun on somebody's head and then saying that, look, this is it. Now, as Lou pointed out, we have been studying this issue since long, since the time the WTO came into being. And it's a part of the broader trade and non-trade debate. I mean, what is the kind of assurance that the developing world has that tomorrow we have environmental standards in trade, and then you will not bring in labor standards? This is something which has been knocking on the door for since long. So the larger issue, as many economists also believe, that the trade agenda should not be contaminated with the non-trade issues. And we are a supporter of that. Not that we are not a supporter of better environment or better labor standards in our own country, but it's subject to what our development levels are concerned. And if you look at, this is there in the Doha agenda as well, trade and environment. So it's not only MC12, but it goes back a little longer than that. And we've been talking about it since long. It was there even when in Marrakesh, when the WTO was launched. And at that time, I remember the Indian trade minister saying, that's fine, if you want to bring in trade and environment, and this is what you agreed was that it is trade and environment issues should be subject to developmental concerns, the possibilities of development as to what developing countries would be able to cope with in terms of standards. Now, personally, I have no disagreement at all that we need to green trade. And plastics as a sector, especially as another sector, are very critical, on which I don't think anybody in the South has any problems, except to proceed in a manner that is equitable and that allows the developing world little space in terms of kind of special and differential treatment, which is at the core of the WTO, in order to be able to comply with many of the standards which are coming up. Now, when we speak about, let me speak as an Indian. At Paris itself, which we referred to COP, I don't know, whatever it was, India and France launched the International Solar Alliance. So it is not as if these issues are not bothering people in the South, and particularly India. But the fact is that they have to be progressive rather than be sudden or be ad hoc in a manner that takes back everybody. Now, CBAM, for example, how do you ensure that the dirty industry will not be shifting to the south, which has been a phenomenon since long? Those of you might remember World Bank's famous chief economist then, Larry Summers, had even suggested in a memo that why don't we shift dirty industries to the south where they have a lot of space available. So there is a mindset issue, Lou, in the West that shifting dirty industry to the south, and then you ask the southern countries to cope with the kind of measures that European Union is suggesting or is bringing in or has brought in actually. Which, as I said, is unilateral and is very unfair. Now, so we have to think about something here. That some of these issues that I'm talking about are probably cliched, but they have to be said again and again because they're still relevant. And we are still talking about, fine, shifting a dirty industry, but what about transfer of technology? How do you enable developing countries to be able to cope with new issues which are coming up in the context of trade and environment, for example, training as well. One issue that we are currently engaged in India is life cycle analysis, for example. That is a greening issue, that you ensure that production is done in such a way that it has the least environmental burden. And there is green rating, which is what some NGOs are also doing of various industries. As it is not as if efforts are not being made by many developing countries, including India, in order to ensure that your systems are more pro-environment and not anti-environment, at least. Secondly, as I said, we do wish that there should be inclusive participation in the WTO negotiations rather than it happening as only a plurilateral issue, which was referred to by the speakers before me. Now, how do you bring it into? Now, I'm sure that that a bigger discussion, which includes South-South cooperation, should be able to set a good direction to the trade and environmental agenda in a manner that it becomes something which the developing world realizes that it's their own problem and they have to deal with it, rather than be forced to deal with it through a gun on their head. Then thirdly, what worries us about all these non-trade issues, which has been said again and again, are non-tariff barriers. Many times, many of these issues are used as non-tariff barriers unequitably. There are various disputes which have come out to show as to how these disputes. Look at the very famous tuna dolphin case, which the US lost on the ground that they did not make Ecuador a party because of political reasons. And I'm giving an example of how a non-tariff barrier this happens, and it can be used in a targeted fashion rather than in a generic fashion to improve the. Now, finally, as I said, when you're talking about shifting of polluting industries to the south, EU has an obligation, or this world has an obligation, in order to keep a track of their dirty industries, that don't shift your burden to the south just because our atmosphere is still better. Though I would say that living in India, the AQI is quite high, but that is because of other reasons rather than industrialization itself. With that, Lou, let me close my opening remarks, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. I think I concur that South-South cooperation should be part of this whole dialogue or future work of the WTO. But I think also it's equally important that we should also have a kind of South-North dialogue or collaboration on this subject. Otherwise, I don't think we can achieve the net zero transition as we expected. With that, I will give probably each of the panelists maybe 2 or 3 minutes just to cross-talk or comment on each other, and if you want, and then I probably will go to the audience for possible questions or comments. maybe I would start again with Hoe Lim, and then Ignacio, and then Pradeep, if he could follow. Then is that okay for you, Hoe Lim? If you have any comments on other panelists' presentations.
Yeah, sure, Lou. I maybe just one or two thoughts. I think both of the speakers so far have pointed to one area of commonality, which is the need for real political deliberation and real political dialogue. I think that's the commonality that everybody would like to have. The question is a very practical one: is how do we actually do it? How do we actually make this happen? And it's not for lack of declarations, understandings, frameworks, work programs, and so forth, if I can just be quite blunt. I mean, we have it all. I mean, we have it there since 1994, I think, decisions, and then 1995, and establishment of the committee, and then you can go deep into the history of the committee, and you will find there has been many attempts, and actually some very good documents, of what was deliberated and what was seen as the big critical issues. But yet, we struggle. I best put it, we in general as the international trade community struggle to register a path forward that is, how to put it, that can reconcile the need to be ambitious, at the same time to deal with challenges of development, just transition, and so forth, a whole range. Okay, no easy answer. I think have to come back to the table, have to sincerely do our best to come back. I mean, Secretariat can only facilitate, but to build that space, to build that trust, to come back to the table, try to the best extent possible, and then you've got many experienced negotiators here, so I may be saying very naive things, but but any case, to the best extent possible, to have a frank and dialogue, which is a much more systemic dialogue in terms of what is really required by the world to move us ahead, and that of course includes WTO. And to the extent possible, try to leave aside for the time being. It will always be there and is a very important part of it. More strategic concerns and strategic interests, but at least to have that discussion, and to see whether there are any meeting points. Because I sincerely believe, and that might be simply because I work in the Secretariat, in the multilateral cooperation, of course, which is what your group is about, and I do believe that diplomacy can work, multilateral diplomacy, as painful and as slow as it might be, and as incremental as it might be, because I think that's the only way forward. So that first step has to be made. And I agree, I think, with what both, I think Pradeep and also, Pradeep may not have said it directly, and Ignacio said it more directly, that need for that higher level political direction. I think without that, it's very difficult for delegations in the Geneva community to have a roadmap as to what should they be doing with the CTE, what should they be doing in terms of bridging gaps between difficult political positions or even economic interests. There has to be that leadership, if I can put it in a very broad way, collective leadership at the political level to say, this is where we want to go, and therefore you delegations have to work towards that goal. If they don't have that direction, understandably, I think it's quite hard to know how do we make better use of the CTE? So let me stop there and hope that helps a bit. Oh, one last point, Lou. I am slightly more positive than Pradeep on green comparative advantage of developing countries. I think developing countries do have a possibility to contribute very positively to the new climate economy, and they do have some competitive advantages, and this I think I saw quite a bit of it at COP28, but not just at COPs, but in other places where you see a lot of green entrepreneurs coming from developing countries who are contributing. They're coming up with substitutes, they're coming up with low carbon emission pathways, they're coming up with ideas, and they're actually implementing them. And so I think trade can do a lot to help to scale that up and to give that so-called green comparative advantage to come to the fore and not always to be in the so-called more defensive position. So let me stop there. Thanks, Lu.
Yeah, thanks, Hoe Lim. I think that's highly important to have this kind of political dialogue. I think probably starting from this deliberation at MC13. You also made a good point, is that through this kind of frank dialogue, that at a strategic level, we see some meeting points and guided work in Geneva. I think that will be important to follow up if anything happens at MC13 and for the CTE or other probably formal or informal configurations to carry the work forward. I think that would be the key. Ignacio, would you like to take the floor, please?
Sorry. Yes, thanks a lot. And I would just like to make two quick comments, one on this issue of dialogue and on the development dimension that was very much highlighted by Pradeep. On the issue of dialogue, first, I totally agree, we need political guidance. Without political guidance, it's going to be very, very difficult to have a meaningful conversation in the WTO. And we need to have a clear sense coming from ministers about what is their expectation about what the WTO can do on this trade and sustainable development / environment interface. Secondly, we need to have a culture in the WTO to be able to discuss issues not from a rules, principles perspective, because immediately then it becomes mixed with a legal discussion about WTO dispute settlement, but with a very much of a problem-solving, constructive type of engagement. And I think creating that culture for dialogue in the WTO is going to be critical to be able to advance on issues like this, which are obviously, we know, very, very difficult to discuss. On the question of the development dimension, I can assure Pradeep that as we have been designing CBAM, we have been extremely careful to make sure that we design it in a manner that we think is generally consistent with the rules of the WTO, and also that we have been engaged in a process of discussion from the very beginning. Even before the legislation was adopted, we had discussions taking place in the WTO, in the Committee on Trade and Environment. Now that the legislation has adopted, as you know, CBAM is not something which is introduced from one day to the other. There's at least a 3-year period where CBAM duties are not going to be charged. There's a lot of issues that need to be determined in terms of how CBAM is going to be implemented. And that's why we're very keen to try to develop all of these issues in as cooperative manner as possible. And that's why we want to discuss these issues with developing countries in the WTO, and of course also bilaterally. I mean, as Pradeep obviously knows, because Minister Goyar often talks on issues relating to CBAM. We also have a very intensive dialogue with India on CBAM in the context of the TTC. So this is very much an issue which we really want to discuss, to understand better what could be seen as concerns from the point of view of developing countries, what it is that can be done in order to help companies from developing countries to comply with CBAM. And of course, in some specific cases where you identified a country which could be significantly negatively impacted by CBAM and which is a least developed country, that is the case for the Mozambique aluminium. We are not only talking about what can be done to facilitate compliance with CBAM, we are also talking about what can be done to help decarbonize the industry. And as I said, clearly, this is a dialogue on which we are very much interested on seeing how we can move these things forward. And certainly now one in the European Union is thinking that the solution is for the dirty industries to move to the south. Actually, if we were going to do nothing on CBAM, then is when you will probably have a lot of dirty industries moving to the south, because if we have a price of carbon in the European Union, which is already 80 euros per ton, and it is likely to be increasing, and we take out free allowances from the industry, because that is what we intend to do, we know what is going to happen. Those industries will move away from the European Union and will go to the south.
Thank you, Ignacio. I think that kind of dialogue would be important both on multilateral front and also bilateral front to solve these issues. Pradeep, I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes probably to come back on what the other two say, and then we go for Q&A. Please, you are muted, Pradeep. You are muted. Yeah,
Respond to Hoe Lim. Indeed, when we look at the multilateral context, a new thing which is happening in the world today is the G20 force, which the Delhi summit, which was held in September last year, showed that you can talk together and you are able to come to an agreement in spite of all the kind of problems of Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Hamas, Palestine, etc., etc. So there was a consensus. Maybe this happened the first time in 17 years. It was just because of the sheer desire of the world to be able to speak in a common voice. This is unlike Davos. This is much more intense, mature. Ignacio was there, you were there as well, and so on. So let us not ignore the value of what G20 can bring. And the next summit is in Brazil, which has already started acting on it. And it might be useful for European Union, WTO, etc., in order to raise these issues under the G20 summit, which will probably be easier for us to be able to absorb. Having said that, what is happening quite a lot is, Ignacio, to answer your point, there is an impact of what I call moral suasion, in the sense that there are a lot of industries which I see in the South are greening. They realize that even the finance minister announced a budget which is going to be a green budget. So consciousness is rising, and of course, many of these actions which take place globally do have a catalytic effect on the thinking and your own realization that, look, you can't afford to continue to consume the environment now. In terms of special and differential treatment, that still remains an important thing. And in the environmental rubric, it's called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So we'll have to look at those two principles as something which will underpin these discussions in the future as well. And Hoe Lim, I didn't say, I said South-South cooperation rather than not excluding South-North cooperation, which is happening in a big way as it is between European Union and India. There's a lot of cooperation which is going on. So it is not as if, or US or many countries as such, and in the South, generally, including trilateral development cooperation. I just wanted to share with you South-South cooperation in the context of the negotiating agenda, rather than the substance as such. Because that is where they can get a better understanding. Now, Ignacio, I would like to ask you a question. What about the agriculture subsidies? Are they environmentally harmful? And what is it that the European Union is doing about it?
Pradeep, I think I mentioned that in my initial presentation. We certainly think that trade distorting domestic support is not only bad from the point of view of trade, it is also bad from the point of view of the environment. If you link your subsidies to production, if you link your subsidies to inputs, you are creating not only a trade distortion, you are creating something which is bad for the environment. And that's why certainly the European Union is among those who would want to see how we can try to move forward on the discussion about reduction of trade distorting domestic support. And by the way, with a balance, because I know, Pradeep, how important the issue of public stockholding it is for India. And that's why we think we need to be able to move on both issues, both on the trade distorting domestic support and on the issue of public stockholding. I mean, that's a difficult discussion which is currently taking place here in Geneva, but certainly we are very much of the view that this is something that would also be good for the environment.
Yeah.
Ignacio, public stockholding has to be looked at in its real context, which is livelihood support. Public stockholding is not being used to subsidize the farmer as such.
Yeah,
it is to ensure that the poor get food at a low cost.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep.
And we've ourselves done research at the grassroots on many of these issues.
Yeah, I know, Pradeep, I know how the PSH is important for India. Of course, this is something we have to carry forward the discussion, probably also in this kind of future political dialogue. And with that, I will stop here with the panelists and then give floor to our audience. I mean, we have a lot of delegations, ambassadors here. We also have quite some FMG members around. So I just want anyone who would like to take the floor, pose your question or make your comments. I think the easiest way is that you raise your hand. I'll give you the floor. and then you open up your video and just speak out. So that would facilitate our discussion. I see Jonathan already with his hand now. Jonathan, you have the floor, and I will wait for others. Jonathan, please. Thank you.
Well, thank all the panelists, all very insightful and remarkably concise in covering so many aspects of a very complex web of issues. Let me start off very gently with a very simple question, because industrial subsidies, CBAM, and so on are complex. And as Ignacio says, a good deal of it may require a fair amount of deliberation over some period of time. All I'd like to know, and I've lost track because no one's talking about it anymore, is what's happened to a very simple and doable in the short term contribution to fostering environmental sustainability alongside facilitating trade's contribution. And that is the initiative that seems to have gone moribund on Zero for Zero for environmental goods. And Sherry may wish to add insights into discussions that were started on environmental services and a mutual pledge to not create and to reduce barriers to trade in environmental goods. With all respect to Ignacio, and having participated in very early discussions in APEC and at the WTO, it stalled for a while, not because of the United States versus China, but because Italian bicycle makers objected to what America and China were prepared to do on bicycles as environmental goods, something that Europe respects. But that's just an editorial comment. But the question is, what happened to the environmental goods initiative?
Thank you, Jonathan. You raised some issues which remain dear to me, because I was, from the very beginning, represent China on the EGA and also service discussion. And bicycle was also part of my how to say, portfolio to present China on that. Anyway, I'm gone, but I think I'm sure my fellow former colleagues could do better than I did. I'll give floor to Sherry, if possible, another participant, and then we go back to the panel. Sherry, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Jonathan, for your insightful question and for spurring me to add something on services. Yes, I know at one point there were indeed discussions, I think it must have been about 5 or 6 years in the WTO, about joining environmental services to the environmental goods 040 attempt, but I don't believe that those actually went anywhere. APEC has been doing considerable work on this in the past few years and is trying to develop and finalize a list on environmental services. Maybe Aik Hoe Lim could tell us if there's any prospect at all of joining these two important areas. It's pretty clear that making progress on environmental goods without environmental services is it's not a non-starter, but it's certainly very incomplete. And so is there any prospect of reviving this in the WTO? And that would seem a very tangible outcome that the WTO could try to aim for. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. I don't see any other hands raised, so I will give back the floor back to the panelists. Hoe Lim, you want to start?
Okay. Yes, let me just say a few words. I mean, there are discussions on environmental goods and services within TESD. I mean, within the actual TESD sort of work plan, they have a working group on environmental goods and services. Now, the question I think that remains unanswered by the delegations, they have done a lot of work, actually, a lot of exchanges, and they have gathered a lot of knowledge, but then don't seem to be ready to say whether this means they will negotiate on environmental goods and services or not. I mean, is the question not answered? Let's put it that way. what has been answered is that should anything go forward on environmental goods, it won't be the same framework as the EGA. That at least I think is a signal that is not, it cannot be EGA recommenced, put it that way. And it would need some thinking as to, I think, what Sherry was hinting at, and possibly Jonathan as well, about what would be the reconfigured package that you would have to consider to make it possible to have negotiations, so to speak, on environmental goods and possibly services. And one thing that I think we heard in the working group were ideas. I mean, I can't say there's agreement on things as such, but they're ideas on like, can we make the environmental goods negotiations far more targeted towards what is the environmental problem that is meaning to solve? So therefore, the goods that we are looking at are actually not in the usual frame of like sectoral negotiations where you put forward your economic interests, I put forward my economic interests, these are the bundle of goods, and we, or negotiators, work it out eventually. But that has to be driven by a particular problem that these goods could be helpful to solve. And then the closest they've got so far in this working group is to talk about not new again, but giving it much more focus to a key set of goods and services needed for the renewable energy sector. I mean, this is one focus. And another one is, should they be talking just about tariffs, or should they be having a wider scope? The EGA was on tariffs, but what we heard in the working group was the working group allows organizations and to join and to provide their views, and a lot of it seemed to be suggesting that to have a meaningful EG environmental goods negotiations, it has to address non-tariff barriers, and that also means technical regulation, standards, certification, conformity assessment, things of that type. So I think there's lots of discussions and lots of very good technical discussions that you will find from the working group. The working group intends to make all of this public for MC13, but there remains a political question: what do they do with it all? Do they go further or not? That's as much as I can tell you right now.
Thank you, Hoe Lim. That's already good information. A kind of update from the kind of previous Doha EGA discussions and both goods and also services. And on that, probably as a joke, Ignacio, I'm sure my Chinese colleagues have, instead of bicycles, put forward electronic vehicles on the list for future discussion. Anyway, Ignacio, back to you, please.
Yeah, well, I think that Hoe Lim has made an excellent summary about where the discussions currently are on the issue, because indeed there are very intensive discussions within the framework of TESI to try to see if there is a possible new approach to deal with this question about the market opening in a manner which contributes towards environmental climate goals, and it's a very complicated discussion. I mean, I'm not going to enter into the history of IGA, except to say that it's a little bit more complicated than Jonathan has presented. As you remember very well, the IGA negotiations stopped basically shortly after the time that Trump was elected. And in any case, it's a very different world, the one that we are living now, than the one that we were actually living when the IGA negotiations were in their culminating phase. I think we are going to move forward on this, and we certainly would want to find a path forward. I think we're going to have to imagine a new approach which will be quite different to the one that was tested in IGA, that was very much focused on tariffs, where tariff is probably not going to be the central element of any initiative to market opening when it comes to goods and services that can contribute towards concrete environmental objectives.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. While the clock is ticking forward, we should also march forward. Pradeep, would you like to also make some?
No, my own understanding of the EGS agreement, even in the past, as it was being negotiated, was that quite often even proposals were being made to shove in turnkey projects, which are not necessary. For example, a drinking water plant. rather than the environmental aspects of it. But there's a whole turnkey project which is being. So therefore, many in the South had a problem with it. They said, look, you're going to use it as a kind of a front for doing that. Now, friends, I would like to remind you that many of these issues relate to some other instruments, international instruments, which are very important for us to think about. The Agenda 21, adopted in Earth Summit, which Chapter 4 dealt with sustainable production and consumption, which is what often we are talking about trade and environment. We are looking at sustainable production. What we are not talking about is sustainable consumption. The same thing was reiterated in Sustainable Development Goal 12 in the SDGs agenda. It's called responsible production and consumption. They just changed the adjective a bit. Now, friends, what I think about is when we are looking at agriculture subsidies, etc., we have seen that beef, which is widely consumed in the West, is a very big environmental polluter. There have been studies tomes after tomes to show us what is the kind of harm it is causing. Nobody is talking about that. Nobody is talking about your own consumption patterns, which are impacting the environment adversely. And not that beef it's a holy thing for me, but I'm just talking as a international scholar to show that there are some very vital issues which have to be addressed in this whole debate. Thank you. Consumption issues.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep. I will see if our audience, anyone who would like to raise their hands. If not, maybe while they are reflecting, maybe let me just quickly throw out a question which always is heavy on my mind, and is that I mean, there are a lot of things going on, both multilateral and plurilateral, and we all agree that we need this kind of political dialogue, and we need active participation from the South on this. I know, and we all know that big ones, developing ones like China, India, Brazil, and others, South Africa, are very actively contributing to this kind of discussion, one way or the other. But we do see a kind of probably picture is that the more vulnerable ones, smaller developing countries, especially more vulnerable LDCs, are not yet. I know that sporadically here and there on the TESD and others, there are a few kind of smaller developing countries participating, but we don't see yet a kind of a really extensive participation by LDCs. So on that, I think that we need to do a lot of work. I think at some other occasions I say this, that we, the conveners or the leading members of this, all kinds of initiatives need to be more proactive in engaging these members, trying to share with them what is happening, what may happen, what this means. And on this, we also, of course, need a lot of contribution from non-governmental stakeholders. We need more research. We need more kind of factual sharing with them. So I'm just throwing out this just to see whether Hoe Lim, Ignacio, or Pradeep, that you may have some ideas or could share some information on how we are doing on this front. Yeah, please. Anyone who would like to take the floor on this point? I also see a question from Golette, our member, Golette here. Golette is sharing with Pradeep a study that they have done recently on curtailing excessive consumption through a resource law. So I hope that you could have a look at that. So I'm just throwing out this simple question, probably not that simple. How do we engage the more vulnerable developing countries to make sure that they participate and also contribute to this kind of future dialogue? Ignacio, please.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good question, Xiankun Lu, and certainly something that we are very much reflecting about. I mean, one also needs to take into account that the process of discussion on environmental related issues in Geneva is very, very resource intensive. There's a lot of plurilateral activities. There are a lot of meetings of the Committee on Trade and Environment. And I said it is a big challenge for small delegations to be able to make a meaningful contribution into that discussion. By the way, one of the reasons why we increasingly would like as much as possible for things to happen in the CTE, because it's always easier for small delegations to be engaged in the CTE than to be engaged in many different plurilateral initiatives. But beyond that, I think what you really need to do is much more at the capital, what it is that you can do to enhance the sensitivity and understanding in capitals about the type of issues that we are discussing in Geneva. That's something on which we are currently working with the ITC. We have some program developed with the ITC precisely here to see how small developing countries in capitals can actually be more aware about the type of discussion which are happening in the WTO on trade and environment interface, hoping that would also facilitate that they can actually be playing a more proactive role in those discussions. So that's something that we are currently in the process of developing with the ITC. But I'm sure Hoe Lim would also refer to other activities which are being done by the WTO Secretariat.
Yeah, Hoe Lim, please.
Yeah, actually, it's fairly similar to what Ignacio said. Maybe just to add a little bit more. That I fully agree that, after many years of doing technical assistance, cooperation work for the WTO Secretariat, you can only build capacity in Geneva if you do build capacity in the capital. There has to be a so-called supply chain that has to be developed. And then the other sort of point I think I would just add is that capacity, unfortunately, is very, very transient, because at the end of the day, we're talking about people. People come and go from ministries, people come and go from jobs and from files. So whatever was invested in 10 years ago changes again, depending on whether there continues to be an interest and there continues to be a wish in the capital to be engaged. So what can we do? I mean, some of this is just the fact of life. There's not so much one can do, but I think we can be more proactive to help build institutions. I mean, institutions can stay longer than the individuals. So the capacity building has to be both for the individuals, but also for the actual institutions. And here, on the institutional side, we have an unusual committee in the WTO, Committee on Trade and Environment. When you go to capitals, it doesn't exist. They have Ministry of Trade, they got Ministry of Environment. and so we're trying to bridge a gap that is not there in capitals. And so some examples, when I did some technical assistance to particular countries, smaller ones, sometimes it's easier to work with the smaller ones. In some cases, they're very keen to get assistance to build an institution. So they say, like, how do we actually, bridge the two ministries? How do they actually work together? How do they actually have a sort of institutional framework? What would be the so-called blueprint for such an institutional framework? We offer a few ideas. We try to help them out a bit, but it's not really completely in the nature of WTO technical assistance, because our technical assistance tends to be very punctual. It's what the members wanted, that we go in for a couple of days, we do a training workshop, we explain the agreements, and then we're out again. If you really want to develop this sort of institutional frameworks, it has to be much longer. It's not easy, it will take a period of time. But we do have some examples that we could transform more for trade and environment. In the TBT world, which also my division, they have done lots of innovation on technical assistance. They developed over the last year and a half a Transparency Champions program. And that is a program which is more about mentoring and coaching and about developing sort of institutional capacity to deal with TBT notifications in the both senses, in terms of the country notifying and also in terms of how the country could respond to what they have received as notifications. It's a longer process. It's not the 2-3 day fly in, do your PowerPoint and fly out. But it is resource intensive. I cannot pretend that it's not, but and there it's a bigger question about are members willing to equip the WTO Secretariat to do this type of technical assistance. I personally think there's a lot of low-hanging possibilities here that do not need to have new resourcing, but more synergies between ourselves, WTO, Ignacio mentioned ITC, we're already a partner that we work with anyway, with UNCTAD, with the World Bank, with others to try to harness this type of new way of dealing with technical assistance. So those would be my 2 cents worth to add. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hoe Lim. I think we have to start somewhere, and now probably by building up this kind of institutional resources for future work. Pradeep, you want to add?
No, I wanted to support what Hoe Lim said, and my own experience with many governments, not only India but many African governments with whom I deal with, is there are tough issues between trade and environment ministry, between trade and agriculture ministries also. And it's very difficult to actually overcome them because of human behavior. I'm talking about human egos. But we have been able to break this to some extent. I mean, I can tell you, narrate you very funny stories, but I don't think we have the time for that kind of thing, except to say that coordination, policy coherence in the developing world is at a very high premium.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep. Based on our discussion now, I think I already listed out at least 4 ministers to be involved in this dialogue: is trade, environment, agriculture, and finance. So I think there's a lot of work, and internal coordination will be key. I will give floor now to Gabriel, and then to see if any other audience who want to take the floor. Gabriel, please.
Yes. So first, I apologize if this was raised because I tried to join and I just joined recently. But I'm coming back from a training session where I was reminded I made use of a proposal by Brazil and the US in another context, trade facilitation, for the involvement, direct and partial or full, of the private sector. And I don't know whether you talked about that, but one thing we realized with COVID, with our DG, is that you cannot deal with such a crisis like COVID without involving the private sector, because in our world, at least, they are the one who make the vaccine. I would say the same with climate and other things. And in particular, the private sector, small and bigger, with the governments, it may help bring together different ministries, because business, when they cross the border, when they act, they need to take into account all these things. So the benefit of the private sector is not only more pragmatism, but it's because when they face the government and their demands, they are used, or they have to develop a use of responding to needs of different sort of type, environment, yes, agriculture, all the world of standards and all that. So I think that all these new big challenges, we should always now think of involving the private sector when it can help not only train, but provide a more sort of a better answer, and maybe more pragmatic and easier. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. This is not yet an issue we have discussed a lot yet, so this is a good moment to discuss this. And private sector not only are more practical, make things easier, but also they sometimes can push the governments to change if they think that the position their governments are doing and may not be that appropriate for them. I'll give floor probably the other way around, probably private sector, starting from Pradeep and Ignacio, and then Hoe Lim. Pradeep, would you like to take the floor on private sector? I mean,
I agree with what Gabriel said, that you have to involve the private sector because you're looking at production issues. And unless they're closely involved and closely understanding, as I said, when you're, like friends of ours are doing green rating, for example, and they're working closely with the private sector, in spite of the fact that private sector and many NGOs don't get along well because of the kind of inherent kind of hostility which builds up. But at the same time, there is a necessity to involve the private sector in this discussion upfront, rather than as a kind of backdrop kind of work because they have to deal with many of these issues. When you look at plastics, for example, or fisheries, etc., private sector is involved in a very, very big way. Of course, then you're also looking at also local governments. When you're looking at plastics, and a lot of pollution is under the management of local governments. And why do we ignore that? I mean, we are looking at a larger agenda that the discussion on trade and environment within the WTO is, fortunately, as I said, is catalyzing a lot of thought processes at the COP and WTO both. Is catalyzing a lot of thought processes, including at the G20, as I saw. Many thought processes are being launched which were not there 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was a more sort of supine debate rather than an active debate as it is now. My own experience of the last 30 plus years in this space tells me that I'm glad that the debate is upfront and that it should be taken forward more meaningfully than the way it is. But as I said, with less guns on the head, in the sense that as cooperative as it can be, then there is a better possibility for the race to adopt it. As I said, I mean, I gave a call. We all know that cattle is a big environmental burden on the earth. It's an agriculture subsidy, which is. Are we ready to discuss that? No, because it is it is sort of specific food habits of a very large population. They're not going to discuss it. But at the same time, there is a deleterious effect. And there is a large number of Westerners that I know, my friends, who have now become vegetarians. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think that's an important aspect we FMG should take up maybe after MC13 on the agriculture subsidies and also environment. Ignacio, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Well, I mean, I think Gabriel would not be surprised if I say that I fully agree with her. I think it's one of the critical issues to reinforce the WTO as an institution, which is a good place to deliberate, is to be able to bring in much more perspective from the private sector, perspective from civil society into the discussions that are taking place in the WTO. And one of the big comparative advantages of the plurilateral environmental initiative vis-a-vis the CTE is that involvement of the private sector, involvement of civil society and deliberation is very much a feature of the discussions which are taking place, for instance, under TESDI, where, as I understand, and Hoe Lim would obviously know more about that, that is a little bit of a challenge to have that kind of engagement in the context of the Committee on Trade and Environment. I may be wrong on that, but I think at least there is much less of a practice to ensure that you debate certain issues and that you also bring a private sector perspective or a civil society perspective to the discussion which is taking place. And quite frankly, we're going to be discussing some of the more important challenges of the trade and climate interface. This is going to be absolutely critical. We are still a little bit puzzled that there is not a lot of enthusiasm in the Committee on Trade and Environment to talk about one of the issues that potentially is more significant for international trade, which is the question of standards for carbon accounting. It's an issue which has huge implications in terms of trade. It is something which I understand some countries don't want to discuss because apparently it legitimates CBAM if this issue is being discussed. I really think this is extremely short-sighted as a perspective, but that's the kind of issues that if we really want to understand what is happening in the world of trade, and we also need to understand it from the perspective of the private sector, it will be extremely important to have those kinds of conversations happening in the WTO. They can happen in the plurilateral setting, but quite frankly, it would be even better if it could also happen in a multilateral setting.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ignacio. Hoe Lim, would you like to?
I think, firstly, of course, as Ignacio said, the TESDI did a new innovation where they actually created space for private sector and civil society to provide inputs to their work. It is, but let me just underline, when we say private sector, we're often talking about private sector associations or groupings of private sector, not necessarily individual companies, although they also have a role, of course. So I can agree, Gabriel, this is certainly very important, we all agree. And then just maybe reflect on a couple of places where this is already happening. TESDI is one. Same with Dialogue on Plastics, they have a similar sort of process. Committee on Trade and Environment, like, as all WTO committees, is subject to committee rules. So currently it's not really possible. But then there's another innovation that previous chairs of committees have done together with the Secretariat. They've created a Trade and Environment Week. So there's a possibility here for voices and inputs to be provided alongside the committee. And more often than not, members actually bring this to the committee itself. So it's a bit more of a sort of being innovative as to how we can do this. And so I think that there's very good possibility here. And the DG ourselves, our DG, she's created 2 groups. And I think maybe Pradeep's in one of these groups. I think it's one is the NGO Advisory Board and the other Civil Society Advisory Board. The other one's the Private Sector Advisory Board. So there are efforts being made to sort of get these voices in. The only thing I would say, and I'm stating the obvious maybe, is that we just have to make sure that the private sector representation is as balanced as possible, captures as many types of companies that are not just the big ones, but the small micro companies, is representative of the WTO membership and so forth. It's a tricky challenge, but I think the will is there and the hope is there to continue move in that direction. So that's all I could add. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that's also very important when you say kind of balanced representation of private sector in the WTO. I think on that is not only DG or Secretariat's job, but it's also members' work probably to engage their private sector associations or even individual companies to see how they can participate in future WTO Trade and Environment Week and other initiatives that are being developed in the WTO. Pradeep, you want to have the floor, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question, Lou. When are we going to have a debate on trade and development, which has been pending with you for a long time?
Okay, thank you. That's my word.
No,
yeah.
We can talk about trade and environment. What about development? How do we cope with environmental issues unless we are developed?
Yeah, for sure. No, FMG has always been attaching a lot of importance to trade and development. Actually, we have done quite a few sessions on this subject in the past many years. I think Natalie could easily share the linkages on these discussions after this meeting. But of course, I mean, this is something we'll feature high on MC13. After MC13, I'll be happy to come back to you and other FMG members and to see how we could carry on this work for sure. Pradeep, you rest assured that this is a very important aspect of FMG and also myself. No worries. Yeah. So with that, yeah, thank you, Pradeep. And with that, I think we're coming close to the end of the meeting, and I just probably would like to give each panelist maybe 1.5 minutes, just to, I mean, not necessarily wrap up. It's too comprehensive to wrap up. Just maybe to quickly shoot out some of the immediate thoughts you may have on this issue, but also MC13. And if not, I will just happily announce conclusion. Anyone would like to maybe start from Hoe Lim or?
Well, I think my take home is that you all have to help me make MC13 a success somehow, particularly on trade and environment. So that would be my ask. And then my last part would be that I think that, you know, the trajectory is already there. It's really going in that direction. The world is going towards more greener solutions, towards more climate-friendly solutions, and the trade world, unfortunately, is a little bit in a sort of state of catch-up. But I'm confident that we can catch up with the help of the members. That's all I have to add. Thank you.
Yeah, good points, Hoe Lim. And Ignacio, please.
Sorry, no, very, very briefly, because I think that there's a director general in the WTO who clearly is very strongly committed to move this agenda forward. And I think from that point of view, the political discussion that we will have in MC13 is going to be extremely important. I'm convinced that there are few other issues that are going to be more critical for the global trading system than the trade and climate interface. And it's an issue where the WTO has a role to play, but defining that role properly is going to be very, very challenging. And having a well-structured, forward-looking discussion by ministers in MC13, I think that's going to be challenging, and I know that Hoe Lim is already reflecting about how to help to steer the discussion in a forward-looking direction.
Yeah, thank you, Ignacio. Pradeep, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with Hoe Lim, and indeed we are all interested in a successful MC13, not only in favor of the WTO itself, but in favor of multilateralism at large, which is under a lot of threat on many accounts, as we can see. Politically, there's very little appetite for UN. Now, where do we stand? And therefore, I had raised the issue about G20 was probably the only effective multilateral organization which is going forward. Secondly, and I reiterate that we need to take a holistic view about many of these things. What happened in Agenda 21, what is happening elsewhere, because you are looking at production patterns. Thirdly, we have to look at consumption patterns because they influence production. If consumers don't demand, producers will not produce. And that is something which, as I said, we require to think about it and as to how we can bring in discipline in consumption patterns so that ultimately environment is better protected. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very important points, Pradeep. And with this, I would like to thank all our three panelists for the excellent presentations, very comprehensive. Of course, there are many things we should discuss, but we cannot do with the limited time. I'm sure we'll come back on this after MC13, hopefully with you panelists again and some others, and to discuss what happens at MC13 and what needs to be done after MC13. And the final point is that we have talked about private sector and a holistic approach. Our next session, probably the last one before MC13, is going to be on February 8th, if I'm not wrong. At the same time, it's going to be on WTO reform and MC13, and we have participation from ICC, and also their paper recently on how we could holistically look at the WTO reform and also MC13. So with that, thanks to you all again, and also to our audience for their attentive participation, and we look forward to next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Lou. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Hoe Lim. Thanks, Ignacio.
Bye.
Thanks, Lou. Thank everybody.
Thanks.
Namaskar.